Log Horizon, Volume 2, The Knights of Camelot, Chapter 1, Return to Akiba, Part 1. Rose, red, yellow, orange. 3 griffins flew above a sunset ocean that seemed littered with broken shards of light. Driven by night gathering in the east, the sky was gradually fading to purple, the darkness deepening. However, this only heightened the beauty of the rose-madder evening sun as it receded into the west, trailing long trails of light over the ocean at its feet. The young man in silver-gray armor who rode the lead griffin looked back and waved hugely, a cheerful grin on his face. The wave seemed to be a signal. At Naotsugu's gesture, Shiroi told the slender girl who clung to his back to hold on tight. At a small tap from Shiroi's boots, the huge griffin he rode tilted just the tip of its wings, each of which measured 3 meters, ever so slightly. As the monster sliced through the wind, it sketched a wide arc, setting a course toward land. After taking to the skies, the 5 who'd escaped Susukino, Shiroi, Akatsuki, and Naotsugu, plus Sarada, the young Crescent Moon League druid they'd rescued, and her guardian, the felinoid Nyanta, had flown straight across the Lieport Strait without stopping and were now approaching the Ol region. As indicated by the slowly sinking evening sun, the world would soon be covered in darkness. And even though they were traveling on griffins, flying mounts that ordinary adventurers didn't have, Shiroi and the others had wanted to put as much distance between them and Susukino as possible that day, and so they'd continue their journey quite late for a group traveling through the wilderness. Setting up a camp is considerable work. It takes a fair amount of time to pitch a tent and prepare a meal. Those who have not done so may not realize it, but simply gathering dry branches to build a campfire can take over an hour. Since the catastrophe, Shiroi and the others had learned how to live in the wastelands and forests that spread across this world, and during their journey to Susukino, they had been careful not to push themselves. However, today, the day in which they rescued Sarada, they had wanted to cross the strait as quickly as possible and reach an area where there would be no possibility of pursuit. The 3 griffins predicted one another's courses and descended in gentle arcs, finally alighting together upon a hill.
I'm not scared or anything.
Akatsuki sounded a bit defensive as Shiroi held out a hand to her, helping her down from the griffin. From the way her gaze swam, she actually was feeling timid. That said, she seemed to have grown used to the new experience of flying during the journey. What she was just a little afraid of was the griffin itself. Griffins were enormous monsters with the upper bodies of eagles and the lower bodies of lions. Fully extended, the span of their powerful wings measured 5 or 6 meters. Like their taloned forelegs, their sharp beaks were those of eagles, and since they were so big, to the fine-boned Akatsuki, they probably seemed apt to take off her head with one bite. As soon as she touched the ground, Akatsuki quickly backed away. Shiroi smiled, a little smile so she wouldn't notice, and took a large chunk of meat from the magic bag he'd shifted to rest at his lower back. He held the meat out to the griffin. To all appearances, it really was a terrifying monster, but like other animals that appeared when summoned by magic whistles, it was the picture of loyalty. As he patted its neck, the griffin happily swallowed the meat in one gulp.
So hey, that went well,
Shiroi's friend Naotsugu said on approach. He had dismounted from the back of his own griffin and was climbing up the hill.
It certainly did. You handled that quite skillfully.
Nyanta and Sarada came toward them from the opposite direction.
Thank you very much. I was really impressed.
Yes, well, don't worry about it. We didn't do anything special, Shiroi answered as Sarada bowed her head. Even though he thought his words were brusque, he couldn't think of anything else to say. He felt shy and awkward, and all he could do was avert his eyes. Up on the hill, where he could look out over the whole area, Shiroi opened his menu, preparing to report in via telechat to Marielle. She had probably been waiting to hear from them for a long time. As Marielle received Shiroi's report, her voice was clearly relieved. Come to think of it, Shiroi and the others had practically stolen this journey north from Marielle's group. The chaos that had followed the catastrophe, the gloomy atmosphere in town, friends divided, everyone haunted by a feeling of helplessness and uncomprehending irritation. Shiroi hadn't been able to stand that atmosphere. That was why he had undertaken the journey to save Sarada. Of course, it was true that he had wanted to help Marielle and Henrietta of the Crescent Moon League. However, it was equally true that there had been something more to it than that. Inside, he had felt an indescribable disgust. Really, don't worry about it. Just don't. Shiroi had done this for himself. That was all. It made his words get all tangled up, and he ended up making a clumsy report.
You've always been a bashful one, Shiroichi.
Nyanta spoke with a serenity that set his listeners at ease. Captain Nyanta.
Shiroi and Nyanta, have you two known each other for a long time?
Sarada asked.
Yep, they sure have. Me too!
Naotsugu fielded the question, interrupting from the sidelines.
We have indeed. Long ago, when Elder Tales was still just a game, Shidoichi, Naotsuguchi, and yours truly often rampaged around together.
When Elder Tales was still a game. Those words sank into their hearts with a keen sadness. He was right. This wasn't Elder Tales any longer. Ever since the day of the catastrophe, although it looked like Elder Tales, it degenerated into a reality dozens of times harsher. Possibly because her thoughts had taken her that far, Sarara's face also fell slightly. It troubled Shiroi, but there was nothing he could say to her. My liege, we need to set up camp. Shiroi had felt as if Akatsuki had rescued him. He called to the others. Nyanta and Sarara must have realized that pessimism wouldn't do them any good. They actually seemed relieved, and they began looking for a place to pitch the tent. The sun was down, but there was no sign of any powerful enemy creatures in the nearby zones. Naotsugu and Sarara began to pitch a small tent. At this time of year, as long as one had a sleeping bag, spending the night under the stars was no problem at all. If it happened to rain all night, though, things would get annoying. Coming to a silent agreement, Akatsuki and Nyanta headed for the forest together. They probably intended to gather dry branches. It was inefficient to start setting up camp at this late hour. Even though they had magic light, both setting up the tent and gathering kindling took time in the darkness. By the time they dug through the hill country undergrowth, set up several stones as a windbreak, and started a fire, nearly 2 hours had passed since the Griffin's landing. At this rate, they weren't likely to get enough rest by morning, but even so, the group's faces were cheerful. After all, they had come through the hardest part of their journey to rescue Sarara. Since they had crossed so many zones via the Griffins, there was very little chance that they would be pursued. They still needed to return to Akiba safely, but since they had already met up with Sarara, speed was not nearly as important as it had been when they were on their way to her. They could even spend a second night in these hills if they felt they needed to. That breathing room showed on everyone's faces. While Nyanta and Akatsuki headed to the forest, which was really more of a series of scrubby thickets, in search of kindling, and Naotsugu went to the river to draw water, Shiroi and Sarara skillfully pitched the tent. Although not a magic item, sailcloth tents were essential equipment for adventurers. They were quite bulky and heavy, but in a world with magic bags that cancelled out the weight of items, it wasn't hard to carry them around. Before pitching the tent, Sarara had apparently had a telechat with Marielle, who was waiting for them in Akiba. Shiroi, of course, had completed his own report a little while earlier. Marielle always smiled cheerfully, but that didn't mean she was not worried. Possibly because of the sudden relief, she had actually sounded tearful during his own report. But as he sat in front of the tent unpacking their things, Shiroi was able to imagine how happy Sarara's report had made Marielle, just by listening to Sarara's side of the exchange.
Hey up there! I got the water!
The one making his way up the hill was Naotsugu. He had brought up water from the spring in portable water skins. The sun had set completely, and the jet-black forest was sharply silhouetted against an evening sky clearer than highly polished turquoise. In a short while, Nyanta and Akatsuki would return from the woods. At any rate, their mission to rescue Sarara from Susukino had been a success. To read along with audio light novel Log Horizon, buy the official Yen Press translation wherever available.